Hello and welcome to Code Harvest. This is part 5 of our step-by-step tutorial video on how to create a product page of an e-commerce website using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, where we also include UI designs such as sliders, animations, and so on. This e-commerce specifically sells electronics, and the company name we created is eLife. Now, due to how long the full tutorial is, we have separated it into different videos and parts. So this is part 5 of the product page tutorial. Check out the full playlist in the description and top comment down below. Now, we also created a tutorial for the homepage of the website. The link to that video is in the description down below as well. Subscribe to Code Harvest, and now let's get started. So now in part 5, we're going to be working on the JavaScript aspect. So as you can see, in this part, we're going to be working on the spacing, which each product card should have. So as you can see, none of the product cards have any spacing, and that is basically because we did not add justified content space between. Now, justified content space between could have saved us a lot of work. However, we're not adding justified content space between. It's because for our slideshow, we're going to add a smooth or slow transition from 260 pixels, which is the width of each product card, down to 0 pixels, so in width and height as well. And justified content basically does not identify or does not recognize that, a product card, even though it is set to 0 pixels, it still recognizes the element, as being displayed, and because of that, it still creates the spacing between that element, the element that has been reduced to 0 pixels and 0 pixels in width and height, and between the pixels that is, being displayed. So for example, if we clicked on the next button and this was set to 0 pixels, there would still be spacing between the element which would disappear and the turquoise laptop, for example. So there would be spacing before this element if this was now kept here. And we don't want that because that wouldn't make the slideshow look nice at all. So we decided to make our own justified content property, and we're going to use JavaScript for that. So we're going to create our own justified content function. So we're going to scroll up in order to create that JavaScript code. So in our head tag, where we included the style sheet, we're going to create an element called script, and this is where we're going to include all of our JavaScript elements. And in here, we're going to start by including an event listener. So first of all, we're going to select the document, and we're going to select document because we want to basically create all of the changes inside this document. So in order to select the HTML document, we're going to use this keyword called document, which is pretty simple. And what we want to do is we want to add an event listener. So we're going to add this method called add event listener, and this basically what it does is it listens for any events, just like the name suggests. It listens for anything that happens or that occurs in the web page. So for example, if a user scrolls up, an event has happened, so it listens for that. Or for example, if a user hovers around an element and causes the element to basically change, it identifies that. Or if a user clicks on an element, it identifies that event or anything like that, whether it be hovering, scrolling, clicking. So whatever the user does, that changes, whatever happens in the document or in the web page, the document will notice, the method will basically identify that. So it listens for any event basically that occurs in a web page. So now we're going to add this parameter called DOM content loaded. So this basically makes sure that the document basically listens for any event listener only once the document, all of the document elements have been loaded. So DOM stands for Document Object Model, and content is basically all of the elements inside the document. So it basically makes sure that not only the elements, but also the structure and the order of the documents are all loaded. And once all of that is loaded, then it listens for any event that occurs in the document. And then we're going to add an arrow function. So we're just going to create two normal round brackets, and then an equal sign with a greater than character. And then we're going to add square brackets. So this is where all of the operations and all of the statements are going to be added in. So everything all the JavaScript code, the main JavaScript code, is going to be added in here. So first, we want to create a comment, since this JavaScript code will be a little bit long, and we're going to name this comment product cards display. And so the document or the web page will basically ignore any comments, so even including the comments that we made in CSS, the comments that we made in HTML, and the comments that we'll be making in JavaScript will be ignored. So it's only for us to use so that we can navigate through our code easily. So now we're going to declare a variable. We're going to declare a variable, and in order to do that, we're going to use the let keyword. If we wanted to declare a constant, so something that would never change. So if we wanted to store in a value that would never change that, then we would use the const keyword and then the name of the constant that we wanted to be. But we want to declare a variable, and then the variable name that we're going to go with is product container width. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to search for the product card container, which would be right here in our HTML document. So when we scroll down, you can see that the product cards container is here where we've stored all of our product cards. So we want to select that container so that we can know the width of it. So first we need to search it in the document. So we're going to select the document, and then we're going to add a query selector, which basically searches and it selects the element that we want to look for. So now in our query, we're going to add an apostrophe or single quotes, and then we add the element that we want to add. So if it was a normal HTML doc element, then we would not add anything. So for example, if it was the nav bar, then we would just add nav. If it was the body tag, or if it was a random div, then we would not add any character before the element. But because just like CSS, we're going to have to use characters. So for example, if it was an ID we wanted to select, it would be a hashtag just like in CSS. But because what we want to select is a class, we're going to be using a dot. So the name of the container that we want to select and get the width is called product cards container. Now that we have selected the container, what we want is the offset width property. So we want to know what the width of that container is. Basically, it calculates what the width of the container is. And it is also important to close a line with semicolon so that the JavaScript knows that this is the end of a line. So now what we want to do is create another variable called product card width. Alright, so the reason why we call it product card width is because we want to select the width of a product card. And each product card will have the same width, which will be 260 pixels. So we're going to set the value to the integer 260. Alright, so now what we want to do is store in the value of the number of product cards that there are in each row or in each line. So we're going to declare and assign a create a variable, and we're going to call it product cards per row. So for example, in this row there are 4 product cards. If this was in a bigger screen, there would be probably more, like 5, 6, 10. But if this was in a smaller screen, then for example, if it was from here to here, then there would only be 3 product cards in each row. If it was smaller, 2 product cards in each row. If it was even smaller, 1 product card in each row. But for this screen size, it basically displays 4 product cards in this row. And we're also going to hide all of this, so it would only be this row being displayed or being shown. Alright, so in order to calculate the number of product cards that are being displayed in one row, we need to use mathematics basically. So we're going to use this object called math, which will help us to calculate the number of product cards that there are in each row. So what we want to do is include a method called floor, and this basically what it does, it rounds the number that we get, or the value that we get from the calculation that we're going to operate. It rounds the number down to the nearest integer. So for example, if it was 39.9, even though it's 0.9, it should round to 40, but we'll round down to 39 instead. So now we're going to create the multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, any type of mathematical operation or function. So what we want to do is first, in order to get the number of product cards that are in each row, we want to first calculate the width, or get the width of the product container. So in this screen, it's a specific width value, and we calculated that using product container width. So we're going to include that variable in the operation or in the bracket. And now in order to understand how many product cards can fit in each of these containers, we need to divide this by the product card width itself. So this should give the value, or the number of product cards that there are, or that can fit in a container. Now, one thing that we're going to have to add is we want to make sure that there is always a minimum of 5 pixels of spacing between each product card. So each product card should have 5 pixels of spacing in between, in order to ensure that the product cards are not squeezed. So for example, we'd rather have 3 product cards with spacing in between than 4 product cards squeezed together, as you can see here. So what we want to do is add in 10 pixels, because we want each of the product cards to have 5 pixels of spacing on its left side and on its right side. So 5 plus 5 would give 10 pixels of spacing. Now, another thing that we're going to add or calculate is the margin of spacing that should be in each product card. Alright, so now we're going to declare and create a new variable, and we're going to assign it to a calculation that we're going to create. And this time, for this calculation, we don't need math.floor, because we needed to use this in order to round the value of this whole thing. We needed to round the value down, because if we rounded it up to a greater number, then that means there might be excess. It might allow an extra product card that would not have fit if we rounded it down, if you know what I mean. So we wanted to make sure that there is a minimum amount of product cards that can be displayed. So we don't want any extra product card being displayed as well. Otherwise, the slideshow won't look good. So now we're going to add the margin spacing that each product card should have. So we're going to calculate this, and this is where we're going to operate the justify content space between function. So what we want to do is we want to select the product container's width, subtracted by the total number of product cards width. So each of these product cards width, all together, so 260 times 4, and then subtracted by the full container's width. So that should give us this the remaining spacing, which realistically in this example would be from here to here. So this will give us this amount of spacing, and then what we want to do is distribute this spacing between each of these product cards, and we're going to use the division operation for that. So first we want to subtract, and then we want to divide the spacing equally between each product card. So we're not going to use math.floor again, since we want the spacing to be its full potential, and we don't want to round that down. So we're going to go with first the container width subtracted by width of each product card, and then multiplied by the number of product cards that are being displayed. In this case there are 4, but for the smallest one it would be only 2, but for this case it would be 4. But we're not going to specify for the number, which is 4. We're just going to add in the product cards per row, which we calculated here. So we're going to go with product cards per row multiplied by the width. So it would give us the spacing remaining. And then what we want to do is we want to first calculate this value before dividing it by the number of product cards that are being displayed, so that the spacing would be distributed equally. So once we've calculated this, according to PartMass, it should first calculate what's in the bracket, and that's why B is first B for bracket. And then next we want to divide it so that we can distribute the spacing equally once we have calculated the amount of spacing that has remained, that is left out basically. So what we want to do is we're going to divide it by the number of product cards that are displayed. In this case there are 4. Now the thing is, in order to add the spacing, we're going to use margin right. So we want for example, the first product or the first element will have margin right, second, third, but the fourth element should not have any margin right, because there is no product card, as you can see, after this element. So it would be unnecessary if we added spacing after this element. So we only want it to be we only want the spacing to be added in the other elements before the last element. So we're going to subtract this value by 1, since we're only going to add the spacing between all of the elements except for the last one. So it's always going to be -1. So we're going to add a bracket. So first it should calculate the total spacing remained divided by the product cards per row except for one of them, which would always be the last element in the array or in the list. I hope that makes sense. So now very soon we're going to add the for loop in order to distribute the spacing and add the spacing, because we have not added that yet. So now we're going to basically identify what the element or what the last element is. So we're going to calculate that by creating a variable, and we're going to call it next element. Actually, let's call it last element. So for this element, what we want to do is, in order to calculate notice what the last element's position is, we need to first identify that first recognize how many product cards there are in each row, and then subtract it by 1 in order to get that position. So for example, there are 4 product cards in here, and in order to get the true position, we have to subtract it by 1, and that is only because of the computer itself, which only calculates the position it starts a position from 0. which is why we've subtracted it by 1. Now we're going to declare a variable and we're going to call this product cards, but we're only going to declare it. We're not going to assign any value to it. And that is because we're going to use this variable in the for loop. So this variable is basically going to store in all of the product cards in a section. So we're going to carry out the same operation or the same function for each section. So that means all headphones, smartwatch. We only added the one for electronics. Soon we're going to add the ones for headphones and all of the rest of the categories or the rest of the sections. Where we want to declare the variable outside, since it feels unnecessary to redeclare every time in the for loop. And the variable is able to change. The variable is able to store in a different value according to whatever section it is. So you'll see very soon what I mean. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to select all of the sections, all the product sections. And each section has product cards and the titles, the arrows and everything like that, but we only included the one for all electronics. So let's assume that all the other sections have been added. So we want to get an array of all of those elements together, and then we want to reiterate through those sections so that we can access the product cards in those specific sections and add in the spacing. So now let's create a new variable, and we're going to call this product sections. And then here, what we want to do is we want to use a document because we want to search throughout this whole document. And we're going to use query selector all. So last time we used query selector because we wanted to select only one element and only one element with this class. But now we want to select multiple elements, so multiple classes in our case. So now what we want to do is add in the single quotes and then the class. So since it is a class, we also need to identify that with a dot or add in the dot character, just like in CSS, and then add in the name of each section, which we named in our HTML file product section. So you can see over here, we named our container product section. So now we want to select all of those sections, and we're going to we're going to add in a for each method, and that is basically a method or a way to reiterate through elements in an array. So we're going to select the array that we just created, which is so that we can reiterate through these sections, and then we're going to add in the for each method. And in this for each method, we're going to create an arrow function where our operation will be executed in. Now, usually our functions do not allow any arguments, but only specific methods or special methods are, allow arguments to be added. Otherwise, for other arguments, our functions, such as the one that we created for the event listener, it does not allow any arguments. Any arguments will be ignored. But for the for each method and for other very few specific methods, it allows arguments. So in this argument, we're going to call it section. So this can be any name that we want it to be. And this will be basically this element's name will be representing the element that the array is currently working on, or the loop is currently working on. So this is the name of the element that is currently working on. And for each method, we'll be able to understand which element that is, even though the name stays the same for each of these sections. So I hope that makes sense. So it's kind of like I in a for loop. If you're familiar with for loops, then it's kind of like an I, which basically represents each element as well as its position in an array. So now we're going to create the arrow function. Inside the arrow function, we're going to be using the product cards that we created above. We declared it, so now we're going to assign it to a value. And the value that we wanted to assign it to is the product cards. So, but we're not going to be selecting all of the product cards in the document, but only the product cards in that specific section that the for loop is currently, for each loop is currently working on. So instead of using document as usual, we're going to use section and then query selector. And we're going to be selecting multiple elements, so we're going to use query selector all. And the name of the class that we want to select, in which the elements have, is called product card, which we named in our HTML file. So it is called, so the query selector is going to select all of the elements with product card, but not throughout the whole document, but only in the current section that the loop is working on. And now we're going to end that with a semicolon. So now let's create a for loop. So now what we want to do is we want to create a variable, and this variable can be anything that we want. We're going to call ours I because that is commonly used. So it can be any name that we want. It can be S or hard, anything that we want. So we're going to go with I because that is most commonly used, and it is good practice to use this letter because it's very easy and simple. And this I basically represents, the position of the array. So we're going to use I in order to access a position or an element in the product cards array. Now what we want to do is we want to update this position every time, because we want to start with the first section. We're going to start with 0, and if you do not know, in computer, positioning starts from 0 instead of 1. So this would be, if this is the first element, the position number is 0, this position number is 1, position number 2, and position number 3. However, regularly for humans, it would start from 1, 2, 3, 4, but for computers, it's 0, 1, 2, 3. And so we're going to start with the first position, and so the position number would be at 0, and we're going to update I. We're going to update this variable every time an element is done being operated on. And we also want to make sure that I is always less than a specific number. So we don't want I to go above the total number of product cards that there are in a row. And this will help us to also hide all of these other elements below it. So we only want to display the first few elements. So now what we want to do is we're going to create a statement in which we want to make sure that the position I is always less than the product cards that there are in a line or that they are in a row. So when a user first joins the web page or enters this web page and has not clicked on anything, they should see the first 4 elements. So that would be 0, 1, 2, and 3 in positioning in this example. So it could be more or less depending on the screen size. So now we want to update that. So once the element has been already operated on, the current element in the product cards array that we're going to be working on, then I should update itself, and it should be incremented by 1. So I++ basically means let I be 1 more than it previously was. So now what we want to do is we want to select the product cards array, and we want to work on each product card individually. So we're going to put in the letter I. So this square brackets basically accesses the element in the array. So first it starts with 0, so we can start with the first position, and it will do it in order since we added I++, as that means the for loop always implemented by 1 until I is no longer less than product cards per row. So now here we're also going to be adding a class, and in order to add a class to each product card, we want to use this property called class list. And then we're going to add a method called add, and in the brackets we're going to be adding a class name. And because this is because it knows that we're going to be adding a class and only a class, because this is only specifically to add a class and not an ID or a HTML doc element, we don't need to add a class identifier, which is the dot. So we can just write the class name that we want to add, and it is called active. Alright, so now we're going to add some spacing, and we're going to include an if and else statement. So what we want to get is margin spacing, which we've already calculated. We already calculated how much spacing that each product card should have to its right side. So remember, we're adding margin right spacing only. And only 3 of the elements, in this case, only 3 of the elements will have the margin right. So it'll always be all the product cards minus 1, because we're not adding it to the last element, since there's nothing next to the last element, so there's no margin right space needed. Alright, so now we're going to create the if statement. Alright, so for this if statement, we want to make sure that this product card is not the last element. So what we're going to say is if the current position that the loop is working on is not the same as the value of the last element, then if it is the same, then margin right should be set to 0. So we just want to ensure that there is 0 spacing on its right. So we're going to select the array, and then we want the position to be specifically the current position that it is working on, that the loop is working on. And we want to remove the margin right, but we need to first call out margin right. So we're going to include the style method, which basically helps us to access the CSS properties. And for specifically, we want the margin right property, but instead of doing it like this, like in CSS, it's gonna be camel casing, so no spacing, no hyphen, but capital R, because the next word always starts with a capital letter. So here we just want the spacing to be set to 0 pixels. And then we're going to include an else statement. So if I is not the last element that the loop is working on, then we can add the margin right spacing. So we're going to copy that, paste that here, and what we want to do is we need to include the pixels value, so it needs to be a string. However, what we've calculated is a number, or it's a number basically. So in order to combine a string and a number together, instead of using these normal apostrophes, we're going to use this special type of apostrophes. I'm not sure what the specific name, what the name of it is, but we're just gonna call it special apostrophes. So it should be the character. If you're using a MacBook, it should be the character that is below the escape key. I'm not sure about Windows, but I do remember that it used to be at the left corner of my keyboard, of my Windows keyboard. So it should be somewhere towards the left side of your keyboard. And then we're going to close that in. So what we want to include inside the special apostrophes is the number. And basically, if we did it in the normal apostrophes, and if we added the variable that we wanted, it would take this as a string, and it wouldn't know, if this was a number that we wanted to show rather than the string margin spacing. We don't want it to take it literally, because we want it to take in the value that margin spacing has stored, but the normal apostrophes does not know. So there's a special way in order to include the number. So first we need to include a $sign and then square brackets, open and close. And inside the square brackets, we want to include the element that we want to add in the string. So now it is able to identify, the value in which this variable has stored. So it will not take, margin spacing literally as a text, but as the value or the number that is stored. And now after it, we can add anything that we want, any string, but specifically we only want the string px. So now what this should result to should be, something, for example, if margin spacing was 40, then it should be 40 pixels. And we can also add something to the left if we wanted. It can be anything that we want, spacing, but we don't need any of that, because strictly it should only take in the number and the string as well. So now when we scroll down, we can see that the spacing has already been added and has already been distributed equally towards all of the product cards except the last one. Alright, and the last thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be copying this whole section, and we're going to be pasting it for all of the other sections. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So for 5 of these sections, we're going to copy this and paste this. And the only thing that we're going to change for each section is the section name, of course, the title, as well as the product cards. Alright, so now we're going to be working on a new section. So we've already added the product cards and distributed the spacing equally. So now what we want to do is include a function that will allow the users to click on a heart button in order to add items to their wish list. Alright, and now we are at the end of part 5. In order to learn the full wish list and add to cart feature tutorial, stay tuned for part 6. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button, comment down below, and subscribe to Code Harvest. Thank you so much for watching. Now see you in part 6 of the eLife web series. Goodbye!